Welcome back. Our previous lesson was on how subsidy offered to buyers shape equilibrium outcome. Today we'll be moving on to price ceilings and price floors. So sometimes government decide to regulate prices directly to ensure that prices don't go above a certain amount or below a certain amount. So when the government sets a maximum price, this is referred to as setting a price ceiling. And an example of a price ceiling is rent control. So when the government steps in to say there's a threshold of rent that landlord cannot charge above, that becomes price ceiling. Now, the first thing we need to know about price ceilings are that price ceilings are binding or they have an effect when they are set below the equilibrium price. When price ceilings are set above the equilibrium price, they do not have any effect. Now, let's look at that before we examine the actual case of price ceiling. Now, looking at this curve, we can see that the equilibrium before any rent control steps in will be at point A. This is where the supply and demand curve intersect. And the equilibrium price or rent in this case will be £1,000 per month, and the quantity will be 500 apartments being rented. If the government were to set a price ceiling above the equilibrium price, that will mean that the government could say, in this case, do not set your rent above £1,200. Now, the equilibrium rent at the moment, or equilibrium price at the moment, is already £1,000. So if the government says don't set your price above £1,200, then people are still going to maintain the £1,000 that they are charging, and that then it means that the price ceiling has no effect. So if the price ceiling is set above the equilibrium price, it won't have an effect because the threshold that the government will set will be above what is already existing in the market. Then people will charge the existing price and nothing will change in the market. So if the government wants price ceiling to be binding, then it has to set it below the equilibrium price. So let's assume that the government establishes a maximum rent of £700 and it says this is the maximum rent you should charge for your apartment, which is a price ceiling in this case. So at this rent, you'll find out that if you map it to your supply and demand curve, supply will reduce to 450. This is because the price of apartment has reduced, and as the law of supply says, lower prices reduce the supply of the good. So suppliers are willing to rent 450 apartments at this price. However, if you map the 700 price to the demand curve, you realize that demand increases to 600 apartments. This is because as prices reduced, according to the law of demand, quantity demand has to increase. So consumers would demand 600 apartments at this price. Now you realize that we have moved from the original equilibrium point to another point in which demand and supply are not equal. So the difference between the quantity demand and the quantity supply in this case becomes a shortage. Now, shortage just implies that quantity demand is more than quantity supplied. There's more demand following the good than producers are willing to supply. So the good is scarce, or there is shortage of the good. So that is the effect of a price ceiling. It increases the quantity demand and reduces the quantity supplied, leading to a shortage in the market. Now let's look at price floors. When the government sets a minimum price, this is referred to as price floors. For price floors to be binding, it has to be set above the equilibrium price. When a price floor is set below the equilibrium price, it does not have any effect. Now, price floors does two things. It raises the price of a good, example, minimum wage. So the government could say the wage at which workers are being paid is too low. Let's increase the wage and set a threshold below which producers or employers cannot pay their workers. So that's it's one aim of price floors. It increases the price of a good, and in this case, it's wage. So it increases the wage that workers will be paid. And the next effect of price floor is that it lowers the quantity sold. So, for example, the government can set minimum price for alcohol to reduce alcohol consumption. So the government can step in and in an attempt to reduce the consumption of alcohol, say you can't charge below this amount so that it will disincentivize people to consume alcohol. Now let's look at the market for alcohol as an example for price floors. As we said before, price floors are binding when they are set above the equilibrium price. When they are set below the equilibrium price, they have no effect. Let's analyze a price floor set below the equilibrium price and see why it has no effect before we move on to the actual case of above the equilibrium price. Now assume that the government steps in the market of alcohol and establishes a price floor. Before the price floor takes effect, equilibrium is at point A, where the price of alcohol per can is £2 and 500 billion cans are being sold. Now, assuming the government steps in to say do not charge a price below 1.8 per can. Now, obviously, the £2 that it was being charged, it's not below 1.8. So then the producers will still maintain the £2 they are charging. So in this case, the price floor won't work because it has been set at a threshold that is below the equilibrium price, and producers can still maintain their original price without violating the government regulation. So for a price floor to be effective, it has to be charged above the equilibrium price. Now, assuming the government says do not sell alcohol below £2.5 per can. Now, this regulation will be such that it will increase supply and decrease demand. When you map this 2.5 to our demand and supply curve, you realize that demand reduces to 420 billion cans. This is because the price of alcohol has increased and quantity demand will reduce. And similarly, supply increases to 570 billion cans. And this is also because price of alcohol has increased due to the price floor, and quantity supply will have to increase accordingly, according to the law of supply. So consumers will demand 42 billion cans per year at this price, which is 2.5, and suppliers will be willing to sell 570 billion cans per year at this price. Now, this will yield what we call a surplus. And a surplus is the difference between supply and demand in this case. So this is our surplus. And in this market, there'll be a surplus of 150 billion cans, which is 570 minus 420. So quantity supplied is 570, but the quantity demand is only 420. So there will be excess 150 billion cans that haven't been bought, which is a surplus. So this means that producers will be willing to produce and sell up to 150 billion more cans of beer at this price, but they are prevented from doing so by the government. So what we learned from our lesson today is that price ceiling reduces the price of a good and causes a shortage, but price floors increase the price of a good and causes surplus. So this is all that we have on our lesson on price ceilings and price floors. Our next lesson will be on quantity regulation. If you enjoyed today's lesson, consider subscribing. Thank you.